Hello, everybody. Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today we have Matthew Pirkowski. I've followed Matthew for a few years on Twitter, and I find him to be one of the most fascinating accounts. It's one of those accounts that I really have to think hard to understand what he's saying a lot of times, but I often find it very gratifying to do so. We also have various scuffles on Twitter sometimes, difference of opinion or worldview, and so that's also interesting. I wanted to get him on today to talk. Generally, title this podcast. This is his suggestion: energy, emergence, and adaptation. So to try and understand, doomer optimism has always been about, things we see that are really fucked up in the world, and but also reasons to be optimistic. And how can we operate in a world where we see so many things going wrong? And I think it's helpful to kind of take a deep history lens, an evolutionary lens, taking into account some fundamentals like energy, like the process of emergence. I think that'll help ground how we're talking about these issues. So without further ado, Matthew, welcome.
Thanks, Tristan. It's great to be here, man. Looking forward to digging into all these topics. I think they're quite apropos of the time and things that we need to think through at far deeper levels than we tend to in popular culture to really get a grip on how we got here and how to move forward as individuals and communities and perhaps as larger political entities as well, although that's always fraught with issues.
Yeah, I think a lot of doomer optimists would agree with that statement. We do speculate on kind of larger scale assemblages, but I think often with a lot of caution, because we've seen a lot of historical precedents for how that can go very wrong. Okay, so maybe we can start. So on this topic, again, framing it as energy, emergence, adaptation, and particularly, I think maybe the context for the discussion is we've gone back and forth on the role of energy and ideas like degrowth or say high energy regeneration, and I think these are some pretty fundamental topics when we're thinking about in many ways we're causing ecological harm. In many ways, the biosphere itself is being less stable for the purposes of human life and many other animal life as well. And you generally seem to be a little bit less doomeristic about it, in the sense that you kind of see this historical evolutionary perspective of creatures always kind of finding a way to kind of respond to energy constraints in some kind of creative, adaptive, emergent way. And so you, for example, see kind of, not only not kind of expecting necessarily a lower energy future, but a higher energy future that nevertheless bends towards regenerative, also a regenerative future. And oftentimes people kind of see those as the same thing. Like higher energy means more extraction, more degradation of the environment, but you often argue that's not necessarily the case, and we can look through deep historical precedent. And so I guess with that do you want to kind of tell your story and or tell your kind of how you think about these things, and I'll ask for clarifications here and there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot for us to unpack here, and I think we should. I'll probably try to start with maybe like a high level tight loop over that sort of like sequence of energy, emergence, adaptation, and then we can maybe revisit each one of those in turn a little bit more deeply, because they really do need to be revisited, especially beginning with energy and questioning or like going back to our assumptions of our understanding of what we see or talk about when we're talking about energy in relationship to forms of energy that we're familiar with interacting with. So there's a big difference there that we should unpack further in terms of how that cashes out. But fundamentally, just a high level on that one, energy is this potential for change, right? It at the deepest levels, when we use that word, we're often talking about the forms or the sources, the local ways in which we are able to tap into a flow that allows us to do some other process that's relevant to our lives, or the types of things we need to get done to stay warm, or to cook food, or to move from point A to point B, or to execute some sort of process to facilitate those, or some socially relevant process. And so we tend to see things because what's closest to us is the way that flow interacts with our lives or intersects with our lives. So you can see that you plug something into a socket, or if you run a wood stove, you can actually observe taking wood and putting that in and then feeling the heat coming off of that process. But when we talk about energy, it's this word that's an abstraction over that entire domain of transformations, right? And that potential of different kinds of transformations. And talking about or pointing to systems that are capable of that continuous transformation over time. And so we can unpack that further and later, but this gets into this question of emergence, and emergence being related to energy in the sense that not only are processes continually in relationship to sources of possible change, but as they tap into that, because of the energy entropy relation, because of the fact that we can't always use that energy perfectly, because there's always some sort of, what you could call waste heat or entropy or side effects. You're introducing some sort of instability or randomness or increased heat in your local system. Like if you look at the flow diagrams of energy across our entire network of energy use as a globe, the giant, the largest waste portion of the energy produced is not because we're being wasteful. We actually transfer and use it relatively efficiently. It's just fundamentally the waste heat and entropy, right? So there's always this question of like, that change is going somewhere other than where you want it to go, and that can have its own set of side effects. Interestingly enough, we're beginning to have a picture of life itself and emergence that allows us to connect the increasing complexity of systems to more and more processes tapping into the other side of the usage of that waste heat, right? So this is where you get into, ecologists are very familiar with these capacities for metabolic cycles or ecological cycles, where you actually establish not just a linear input of some resource and an output of some waste, but you can actually, have a closure there. Composting is a really wonderful example of this, right? And all of the natural processes that are analogous to that are kind of the metaphors that people are quite familiar with. But fundamentally, if you kind of understand the overall emergent set of all living processes in the biome, constantly creating these side effects, but also searching for other processes that can take those as inputs to create sort of pathways that are closed, that are constantly more and more efficient because they're working with less and less and less. That entire set of stable coherence, let's say, is essentially the sum of what we see as the biosphere, right? And we exist within that as our own nested subset of all of these structures with our own side effects on all of the biomes that we're associated with, on all of the fields of energy and structure and mass from which we take our energy flows, whether those are solar as mediated by trees or plants, or through ancient trees, plants, and animals in the form of oil or natural gas, et cetera, right? Now, adaptation, how does adaptation factor into this energy then emergence trajectory? Well, adaptation is fundamentally that process. We're talking about that process in light of evolution. So evolution is sort of this variance first, like you have a divergence of different ways of things happening. So one particular energy flow might have a set of, let's say that you and I live potentially different lives, or like me out here in the quote unquote wilderness I'm living a very different life than someone in a city in terms of where I get my energy, and then what happens to those different byproducts of that energy. Like I have byproducts of wood stove, I have that input and that output relationship. So myself and someone in a city who just basically doesn't think about the fact that they have an electric heater, the energy comes from some other input, and they don't have any waste necessarily or output of that from their perspective locally. Those are two different variations of patterns of being in the world, right? And in terms of selection and adaptation, selection and adaptation is really a question of how the different variation in the world for any sort of relationship between a creature and its functional reality, its connection to its niche, its ecology, how that actually finds some sort of sustainable closure, sustainable relationship across time in a way that is differential from other entities of its kind, right? And then depending on that variance, the future continues preferentially from those more stable or proliferative tendencies. Now, the question we talk about often is like, is it possible in the short term that certain ways of being seem very effective in the short run, these high energy ways of being, these ways of being that might depend on, for example, resource extraction from a remote location or a source like nuclear with extremely potential, or as perceived sometimes with extremely negative potential externalities, or externalities that might, in the short term, allow us to grow very quickly, but in the long term, completely undermine our ability to exist at all. So like in the short term, there might be a selection or adaptation pressure to choose certain energy technologies that in the long term might undermine our ability to exist. And this is the question of sustainability, ecology, et cetera. So that's sort of the landscape that I'm thinking about and talking about. And I'm happy to go back anywhere in that sort of overview, 50,000 foot overview, and really dig in and try to get more concrete and apply that to things that might be a little bit more practically relevant or tangible for people.
Yeah, well, maybe we can start with an example in evolutionary history, where we had, some organism process, there were these energy constraints, or there were some kind of constraints. And from the point of view, from the point of view of that, organism or ecosystem, it could have been perceived as like the end of the world. And through this process of emergence and adaptation that you're describing, actually there was some kind of fundamental transformation that set evolution on a different path. You want to, yeah, that would be
definitely. I mean, the archetypal example of that I enjoy talking about and is typically a fruitful entree to more conversation is the example of trees themselves. Interestingly enough, right? Like, and maybe this was a leading question because we have talked about this before. But this question, during the Carboniferous period, there's an adaptation, there's a change in sort of the biotic processes that constituted plant life, where a particular protein that didn't exist before, lignin, which is the protein that essentially enables for much more rigidity in stem or trunk, what became trees, right, branched out of this capacity to produce this protein. And that protein enabled them to grow higher, which enabled, relative to the other plants in their area, more access to sunlight, and therefore generally an easier or better capacity for photosynthesizing, therefore more proliferation, right? And they grew at a rate that was dramatically disproportionate to other plants that didn't have that capacity in their environment, right? And the only issue with that at the time was that nothing in the natural biotic landscape had the capacity to break down that lignin after the tree had run its life cycle. So it became a byproduct, a waste product, an unclosed cycle. And that lignin essentially was sitting around and still binding, much of this matter and generating, like literally bogging down the planet, given that it was producing what we call peat bogs and other types of environments that are highly anoxic or low oxygen environments and highly acidic. These environments are not great for a robust, diverse ecology of life. And so it was kind of suffocating a lot of microecologies at quite a large scale until we see the appearance of something called the white rot fungi on the scene, right? And the white rot fungi is, anybody who's been around rotting trees to any extent will have noticed these striated fractal white structures amongst the tree trunks. And that's actually this white rot fungi, which is really the easiest way to think about it is a slow burning process. But that metabolic energy and some of those byproducts are also then put back into the soil and other networks and microecologies by way of the white rot fungi. So that closes the loop, brings it back into cyclic relationship, and enables or re-enables a whole new set of patterns that would not be possible beforehand. And so you see this shift between, you know, innovation, proliferation, potentially, you know, negative side effects depending on the perspective, and then closure with some other process. And that new closure actually, instead of killing off everything, opens up an entirely novel possibility landscape. And it's not that that's mandated to happen. It's not that that will always be positive, but it is the case that it does open up new possibility spaces, and that the patterns we create, or the patterns that are created in those possibility spaces, are what come to define, you know, now if we think about trees and we think about nature, it's the archetypal representation of sustainability or ecological integrity, right? We associate that very closely with this idea of natural balance or harmony, even though that was not always the case. And I'm kind of making the analogous case for ourselves to be able to see that process or those possible options, and also internalize that and say that it's not necessarily the case that just because energy flows are coming through us, that means all of our patterns of behavior using those energy flows will destroy our ecologies or our context.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, but we also know that there's been 5 great mass extinctions events before, you know, now people are calling this the 6th great mass extinction, anthropogenic extinction, and the extinction rates seem to bear that out. So I guess how does that relate? Like when do we, you know, this might be an impossible question to answer, but you know, when do you have the conditions for kind of a great mass extinction event, and when do you have the conditions for kind of this new emergence, and are they the same thing?
The precursor, so yeah, I mean, I think the precursor to either, I mean, depends which extinction event we're talking about in terms of what examples we want to use, but or like what properties are drawn out by each example. So you could talk about something like the Cambrian explosion, right? Like, and is the Cambrian explosion a proliferation of life or a mass extinction? I mean, it's both simultaneously, right? So like, you get new properties of eukaryotic life, and it unlocks this whole new field of experimentation. And then because of the fact that that proliferation of experimentation, you know, just the majority of ways to be or exist in the world that aren't self-destructive is just so much smaller than the ways that are not sustainable. Like it's essentially zero, right? If you actually do the math, it approaches zero. Like the ways of, because combinatoric spaces get so large, the ways of combining things that actually work and are actually able to self-sustain is so small relative to the way that those things could just be combined. That when you get massive proliferations, it's almost always the case that you're also going to see attendant extinctions, or many of those proliferations just not work. I mean, an interesting recent analog is this, you know, whole world of you know, digital economy, right? Quote unquote Web3. If you look at this as a novel set of possible ways of combining certain primitives in this new technology space of innovation, there's been a massive proliferation of all sorts of little companies' behaviors. You could say parasites, right? People will say shitcoiners, et cetera, et cetera. And the funny thing is, people will use that to smear that space. But you could also say, once again, it's a reflection of the inevitable dynamic of proliferation and pruning that occurs whenever you introduce certain new primitives into a space. And so when you're talking about, is it necessary that there are catastrophes or catastrophic extinction events associated with this adaptation? You know, the question is like, yes, and then beyond that, how bad does it need to be, or how smooth can a transition to something else be, right? And this is the interesting thing about the human role and human mind, as well as, you know, certain entities and brains on the planet exhibit this as well. But we're sort of the archetypal case of sort of self-reflective consciousness that spends a lot of time imagining possible futures and trying to select from those possible futures, hopefully the ones that have the least catastrophic trajectories of spanning different regimes of behavior, or how we call this innovation, we call this disruption. We see a lot of different words these days and have been talked about in the past, but this has always been a part of the human mythos, the human dialogos, like the idea of flood mythologies, the idea of renewal, the idea of archetypal tree of the world metaphors, yin and yang, like this idea of novelty, chaos, new order emerging from that is something that is literally as old as human psychology itself, because we are the kind of creatures that are constantly attempting to look out into the world and identify the way in which the current stable closures, the stable cycles that we have in relationships that we have with the world, the way in which those are breaking down, and how they might either be repaired or transcended with something that is less likely to break down in the same way. And so, I don't think it's avoidable, that pattern. I don't think that pattern is avoidable. It just seems too deep and too seems to be a characteristic aspect of what life is doing as a process that is able to maintain organization in light of entropy acting on it. But the question is how bad does it have to be at any given point, and to what extent are we able to play a role in that process, such that we're not just blindly growing to the edge of the petri dish and experiencing a massive population catastrophe,
right.
Which is what a lot of the initial models and ethics around like the Votian vision, like William Vogt, like the Votian vision of sort of ecological catastrophe were predicated on, which, while true in a petri dish, the story is a lot more nuanced and complex when we actually really think about how it applies to information processing, beings capable of representing different possible futures and choosing between those, if we admit that we actually have some degree of agency.
Right. So, I mean, this brings to mind this model that's usually applied to landscape ecology of kind of the panarchy adaptive cycle, and some people, like to extend that to kind of social systems as well, and this idea that kind of our current, let's just say, a current global industrial civilization as it's currently constituted, is breaking down or is going to break down due to inevitable various resource limits, etc. But and this leads to what they call the back loop, which implies some kind of release or collapse, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to be seen in a negative context. That they're likely, like there is with every change, there is collateral damage, and none of us are immune from potential impact of that. But there's also it also frees up, let's just say it frees up energy or for reorganization, for new creative structures. I'm wondering how much do you resonate with that kind of framing, that we're headed towards some kind of back loop, and it could either be very catastrophic or it could be a relatively smooth kind of transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's identifying with, that identifies a deep archetypal property of all living systems again, which is recursive feedback, right? Like we're always in feedback relation to, I get sensory data in that moves through a set of linkages and processes and impressions in this set of complex nested systems that is myself, that moves back out into the world through behavior, rinse and repeat. And then if you scale that up to the size, the temporospatial scale of humanity as such, you get this kind of idea of a feedback process of, in theory, hitting limits based on certain behaviors, and then that sort of cascading back upon us. The interesting thing about that, I mean, I think where I primarily differ is that constraints or limits, I don't see these as, there's different ways of looking at constraints. I'm very much fond of the phenomenological perspective, which is the constraints are seen as a function not just of what exists in the world, but also as a relationship between the thing perceiving and what is perceived. And so much of the language around sort of limits to growth or constraint-based perspectives is sort of just take the constraints as an objective perception, objective, measurable, empirical data point or set of data points that are predictable in relationship to our behavior. Mm-hmm. And I would say, like, if tying this back into the interpersonal domain, you can see a person in front of you, and depending on your context, if I'm lazily strolling in a good mood, maybe I'll enjoy a conversation with that person. Maybe that's a dance partner. Who knows, right? Conversational or musical dance. But if my goals are beyond that person or have no relation to that person can become an obstacle, right? So that's that phenomenological lens in terms of, like, the person in front of me isn't one thing. They're a set of potentials, and I exist in relation to that set of potentials as a function of my own goals and processes and constitution. I bring that up because I think that the primary limits to our current quote unquote growth derive far more from certain mechanistic assumptions and principles that are baked into the ethos underlying a particular domain of industrial and corporate construction, modeling, and behavior, as opposed to fundamental limits on complexity that are derivative of the actual external ecological processes in which we live our lives. And so this is where we get to this question of, I do think that through different organization of our relationships and our ways of relating to energy, our ways of relating to generating byproducts that sustain us, but that also do a better job of not necessarily just generating disruptive or disruption or injecting chaos, let's say, into the processes upon which the living processes upon which we depend. Like, there are ways of changing that, but it's hard to do so when we are still in the wake of essentially the mechanistic metaphor, a particular Taylorist view that is still essentially like, look at a system, break it down into its constituent parts, and then make every single one of those relations as efficient as possible in relation to an extremely narrow band set of goals, right? That is going to, produces a lot of local efficiency, but it also maximizes externalities. And so it's like, there's an interesting question of to what extent can you internalize externalities while still enabling a group of people to achieve something in the world, right? It may be the case that the type of thing that internalizes all of its externalities just simply can't exist as a side effect of having any causal agency whatsoever. But I do think we can do better than what we're doing now.
Yeah. Okay. So this gets into, how I kind of frame it in my mind of how you think about this is this kind of, like bending towards more closed loop kind of regenerative activities. And you've given the example of, say, as simple as like recycling materials, like, that we haven't been able to recycle before. And this takes knowledge, takes new technology, taking something out of the waste stream and, bringing it back into, a useful part of the system. And we can get into kind of the energy component of that in a bit. You've mentioned that, one advantages of, say, a high energy future or an energy source that has relatively low externalities compared to, say, most fossil fuels would be that it would allow us to, say, achieve the activation threshold for, say, recycling much of the metals in digital, electronics, for example, which would help us to retrieve those metals for other productive uses, as well as keep them out of the waste stream. Do you want to talk about on that a little bit?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that because it's right at the intersection of a number of core principles here. So, I mean, you mentioned activation energy, right? And just for anyone listening who might not be intuitively familiar with that idea. It derives from the domain of chemistry, in which you can have a process or a reaction that would continue under its own tendencies if only it were started. If only some energy were injected into that initial process, it would actually then, carry on its own accord towards some other endpoint. And so the question or the analogy here, I would say it's actually like it's a direct homology, or it's a direct equivalence in some real functional sense, is this idea that many processes that we could in theory do right now, we don't do. Processes that are necessary for closing the kind of loops that would make a large difference, we do not execute those processes, and we do not close those loops, because the fundamental cost is too, in terms of dollars as a representation structure, that's a whole other conversation, is too high, largely due to energy inputs. And metals and minerals is one. Plastics is another. Like repolymerization processes, we're coming a long way on the side of knowledge of how to actually take plastics and actually, because plastics aren't easy to transform from a plasticified polymer back into a flexible polymer that can be reused, because of the fact that these polymers are extremely complex structures that, well, they're simple structures that form complex essential tangles or emergent properties that are hard to sort of go backwards. And so we know how to do that, but we don't do it because doing so takes a lot more energy relative to what you can do with those outputs than makes economic sense. And interestingly enough, what I just said also identifies two elements to being able to run any process, which is the energy inputs, which is the potential for transformation or change, but then also the information needed to know how to actually perform that set of actions, right? It's not enough to just have the energy. There's also the information. You have to bring both the energy and the information and the will to bear on any process or incentives on any process for that process to actually occur in the world. And the reason I bring that up is because it introduces this question of, or this idea or concept of free energy. And free energy differs from just energy per se, because free energy gets a little bit more specific and says, yes, this set of relationships has a certain amount of embodied energy within it. But, and this term was coined during the initial parts of the Industrial Revolution, when people were trying to say, essentially, I have this much coal, how long can I run a steam engine, right? Because they were saying, like, it's not 100% efficient. This is interesting. Like, in theory, there's this much energy in the coal, but the engine is only getting us so far when we make it do work. And so what gives, right? Well, okay, so this is how we start to get the understanding of actually when you change a particular structure, in that case, the coal, such that you're using its potential for change as your own ability to do work or produce change, you don't get a one-to-one exchange there. You have some loss. And that loss goes out into the world as entropy or disorder, and then you can perform some work. And there are absolute limits on that. But the interesting thing about that free energy is it's also relative to what we know how to do, right? So what we know how to do and how we know, like the information we have about the world that allows us to interact with systems that constitute embodied energy in different ways, means that we are able to tap into those energy flows in a range of ways that have different side effects in terms of efficiency and a number of other properties. And so a lot of it's also about that information and energy relationship. And that's why I focus so much, especially in my personal work right now. I'm actually working with literally building models of creating a grammar and a set of technologies that allow companies to model themselves in information theoretic terms using mathematics derived from free energy equations, something called active inference, to actually help understand these flows, not just in terms of material resources, but in terms of information and uncertainty, side effects, and all of these types of concepts. So moving from the mechanistic paradigm into something that's much more conscious of information and energy relationships in sort of metabolic structures, right? And looking through that lens primarily, as opposed to looking through like, this is a machine, the company is a machine. A person is a machine. The biological mechanism is a machine. It's like we have to take a step beyond that. Like the mechanism phase was useful for allowing us to start understanding or to start picking apart the parts in a dissective manner. But we need to be able to resynthesize, reintegrate all of this information such that we can change our relationships to potential energy using that information in ways that are ideally and hopefully more adaptive and stable. And that's sort of like the large scale frame that I hold in this conversation.
Yeah. How much? So it seems like part of what you're describing is you're saying, if you're from the perspective of a company, of becoming more like an organism and less like an input output machine. And we're talking about, part of that is, or the outcome of that is becoming more efficient with,
Well, it is just a little quick point there. Like it is still to some extent input output, but
yeah.
it changes from material input output
Mm.
to sort of informational perceptual input and
Mm.
embodied action output, right? Like
Yeah.
function. You start getting this more functional relationship as opposed to, we're just taking materials and then producing artifacts as products, selling those to the market, and then, everything else is just subjective nonsense that we don't have to care about as a serious businessman, you know?
Yeah. So I have a couple questions here. Well, one, but then there's also the elements of just having more free energy available to begin with, and this gets into, you've talked, you're more bullish than others in our space on kind of potential for kind of higher energy sources, and you noted fusion energy as being one. How much of this perspective that you're bringing depends on fusion becoming viable and scalable?
I think fusion, I mean, that's a lovely idea. I mean, that alleviates, if that were to exist, and we are getting, we are making more progress in the last 10 years than we made in the preceding 30 on that. But I would say no. I would say like actually the closer steps to us, if we want to just talk about the nuclear domain, is a lot of the third, fourth, especially like newer fourth generation fission that dramatically like. And this comes back to that information aspect, because like the more we learn, like the first generation like the nuclear breeder reactors and these types of reactors that were light water breeder reactors and all of this stuff that it allowed us, like we were children playing with a very powerful set of knowledge and like poking the universe at an extremely deep level with very little safety gear, let's say, right? Like we were playing with fire in the most literal and deepest sense in the universe. We were opening up this space of possibility that if we fucked up, it had extremely serious side effects and very widely dispersed side effects, very non-local side effects, right? And that has that created the initial impressions on the collective psyche, let's say, of humanity, and many of those haunt us today. And it's not that we are wrong necessarily to have concern over that kind of event happening. It's just that we've come a long way in terms of the way that our information and knowledge across half a century or so has now enabled us to generate new ways of relating, new relationships, networks of relationships to that knowledge and material reality, and our need for certain properties within that material reality that are far more self-contained, that have properties of immensely greater safety, that allow for much smaller footprints, that allow for byproducts that are much less toxic and potentially even useful. So in the medical industry and in medical imaging industries. And so I'm not saying that's the only way to go, right? But I think that's a space that's like way more pragmatically available today in terms of reducing activation energy thresholds for all sorts of interesting local and bioregional activity that doesn't actually entail or necessitate either dramatically disruptive inputs to those systems or threaten to produce existentially threatening outputs, right? Not that there are no costs or side effects, because I'm not going to advocate that there's ever a world in which we can fully escape those. That's always part of the calculus, so to speak. But I do think that that's an essential component of the energy landscape, because of the fact that we're not energy constrained, right? We have the knowledge that allows us to take advantage to some extent, or develop, let's say, a more harmonious relationship with E equals mc squared, right? Like that asymmetry in there, the amount of energy embodied in every tiny little bit of mass, that's a huge potential gradient for us to tap into. We're limited more by our wisdom and responsibility there than we are by sort of the availability of that energy, right? And so I think like that's one of the interesting constraints, right? And that doesn't show up on it, like limits to growth. Like I think the biggest dimension on limits to growth is sort of human wisdom and our ability to actually balance pure experimental zeal with low time preference capacity for wise action, right? That's in my mind, like that tension is actually way more fundamental than a lot of the other limits to growth conversations.
Yeah. This comes up a lot because a lot of people in doom optimism space are influenced by like the peak oil conversation, and nobody really knows when peak oil is, or if it's happened, or if when it would happen. Meaning that we've kind of reached the maximum of our output, and it starts declining. The energy return on energy investment starts declining. But we know that, theoretically it has to happen at some point. Some people place that date sooner, some people place it later. And the alternative...
Some economists claim it's infinite, right? Which is,
right. Yeah.
That's an interesting conversation, but...
Yeah. And the alternatives, are, these so-called renewable energy technologies, hydroelectric, but large-scale hydroelectric, there's not really an opportunity for growth there, and in many cases it's already problematic in terms of the local ecosystem impacts and local cultural impacts. You have photovoltaic systems, you have wind turbines. A lot more people these days are talking about the mineral requirements. If we were to say use these technologies to try and replace fossil fuels, I mean, even doing it just to replace the electricity grid is one thing, and to have the sufficient backup because of the intermittency issues, things like that, and the need for batteries, more efficient batteries. But then that doesn't even get into the liquid fuels, the use of liquid fuels for heavy industry, for much of heavy, transportation, things of that nature. And, much of the calculations there don't look very good in terms of, we'd have to move from a, fossil energy economy to basically a metals economy. And the amount of metals that would need to be extracted would be much more than we've ever, historically extracted up until now. And the environmental ecological impacts of that would be profound, and probably not even sufficient, unless, as you're describing, we reach the activation thresholds to be able to, say, find alternative, replacement metals for certain things. Like maybe we can find a replacement for copper or lithium, for different types of batteries. I guess. Yeah. Do you want to speak?
Well,
we have, but in terms of actually,
we're not talking about like primary elements. We're talking about metamaterials, right?
Right. But in terms,
which is the intersection, specifically the intersection of atomic properties and information.
Yeah, right? Yeah. But this goes back into basically the energetic requirements for all of this, right? So if we're imagining an energy transition, and let's just take nuclear out of it for a second, it seems pretty dire to me in terms of, theoretically, perhaps we could replace many of those materials on a very atomic scale, but the energy requirements for that, where is that going to come from? Besides, we're trying to create these self-perpetuate, besides more fossil fuels, right? People have talked about kind of the burst of emissions that would be required even to invest in all of the infrastructure for this new kind of energy economy. And but you're bringing in prospects of nuclear, and it seems like I guess my question is, taking nuclear out of the equation, how viable would you see that transition being? Is nuclear, in order to achieve this transition, kind of a necessary component, just on it, from the energetic input perspective?
Yeah. So this is where we have to start talking a little bit about sort of systems as embodied energy flows, right? Because when you talk about something like the global metabolism, right? And if we're talking about which is when we say the economy, we're really talking about literally inconceivably complex network of interconnected flows that are deriving their existence from a combination of people's needs, energy inputs and material inputs, and people's capacities and our information and our ability to actually execute on those functions. And so that whole system, it's not just an instantaneous thing. It's a series of relationships through time that have a inertia to them, right? Because of the fact that any one of these relationships, pick any part of that entire economic structure, and it's going to have, there's something they did yesterday and the day before, and assuming it's a week or more old, a week ago and a month ago, et cetera. And that changes a bit over time, but there's a continuity. There's continuity properties within that entire fractal structure. And so if you ask the question, what does it take to switch every layer of that fractal structure to a different energy input at once, you're going to get an answer that, with existing technologies, you're going to get an answer that looks like that's not possible. And it like, from a macro zoomed out perspective, that looks like death or collapse or something imploding upon itself if you try to do that. Interestingly enough, I think that the way that, again, this folds back into the adaptation conversation, because evolution experiments, and I don't want to attribute to evolution consciousness. I'm not trying to do that, but just as a shorthand, evolution experiments on the margins, right? And the margins are these smaller contexts. I mean, that should resonate, right, with the localism aspect of what you're interested in talking about, and the extent to which the new patterns, whatever those patterns might be, whatever the connections that will eventually become replacement patterns for, you're not going to be replacing the existing functions. You're going to be creating new patterns that enable that function to, in theory, be served by something that looks completely different than it, right? It's not like we're going to have giant dump trucks running on. I mean, this is the funny thing about why, like, growing a bunch of corn to create ethanol fuels to try to create a direct substitute to put in the gas tanks, or hydrogen fuels as well. Like, that's more along the lines of, like, we need to just, like, maintain the Existing infrastructure at that same scale and try to do a drop-in replacement at that high level. That's the dream of the sort of central planner who doesn't want to lose control and who wants to maintain perfect continuity at that scale. I'm also skeptical about that. I also think that there's going to be instability and some level of breakdown at that scale. But I think that to the extent that that breakdown happens, there's increasing incentive and willingness to experiment at scales beneath that re-enable different paths for those same previous functions or similar functions to be achieved with a different externality profile, hopefully better. Unless the unzipping of that stack is so absolutely catastrophic and so instantaneous that we have zero time for adaptation, I don't see that being the case with respect to our endogenous behavior. That would be something like a comet hitting, right? Like, and then there's not nothing we can do about that, but like, it's a much different conversation. So I think, I mean, it's interesting. Like, hydro is very fascinating along these lines, right? Like, why do we create hydro at the scale we create hydro? Well, the state is trying to create these projects. They begin with the assumption that they need to provide power for this very large region. And so therefore they consider, okay, there's only a certain amount of viable locations for hydropower. Those viable locations for hydropower happen to be some of the largest waterways in, the bioregions of America, creating, the uppermost points of entire watersheds typically. And therefore, by transforming that into a dam, just by definition, all of the downstream effects are going to be immense. Like, it's definitional that you're going to fundamentally introduce that kind of a non-discontinuous change to everything downstream of that large artery of water coming into that watershed. And the other question, the other way of looking at it is like, well, if individuals are actually empowered to run small local hydro in even streams or things like that, meeting individual needs or meeting small community needs, you actually don't have a sort of linear relationship between the externalities there. Like, you can tap into the side of a river ecology in a pretty clean way that is not externality free, but it's not damming the river, right? It's not killing the ecology around it, let alone everything downstream. And so like, when those larger scale processes show themselves to be impossible, and yet there's still a large demand beneath that for reliable, essentially clean energy, especially if people start having intermittent relationships with energy provided by centralized actors, there's a dramatic increase in the experimentation that occurs with more local solutions. And then, you can go from there. Now, the question about trying to run that local experimentation with nuclear, that goes back to this sort of like wisdom and sort of the X risk involved of reducing the costs associated with potentially very dangerous activities. But we're in that world. We're running that world. We're running that world with a little bit of nuclear right now, but more on the biology front, more with the fact that the costs are coming down with respect to all sorts of technologies that, whether we like it or not, we're going to get experimentation. So I kind of look at it more like one of my friends recently said, it's like a competition to see who can be more awesome, as a shorthand. And I think that's an attitude that, whether we like it or not, I mean, from my perspective, I don't see a way around having to embody better ways of being and attract people to those better ways of being. I mean, I think that also probably resonates with the doomer optimism community. I mean, there's the doomer part, which is very focused on those limits to growth and the constraint side and the potential collapse side. But it's also a vibrant community of experimentation and trying to figure out new ways of pairing. I mean, it itself is a representation of using new technology to enable a kind of community that was not previously possible. Yeah. So, I think what I'm saying is at least somewhat consonant with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, we've definitely reflected on that, the fact that, we're calling ourselves, kind of localists or bioregionalists, but we're relying on a, global technology and information stack to communicate with each other and to even have these conversations. It definitely hasn't escaped our notice. I found it really interesting what you said about, kind of at the certain scale that we're used to. And I think a lot of people, again, we talk about kind of the breakdown of our current industrial civilization, and I think that's often what we're talking about. And oftentimes the conversation moves towards what you're describing of these more local patterns. We bring in this concept of subsidiarity, right? Of figuring out, new ways to live where, from kind of a central planner perspective, might start looking like collapse, but it's not. And just a very kind of simple or trivial example is, I guess you could say our car transport system, right? And you can imagine cities, neighborhoods having more mixed use zoning in neighborhoods where people don't have to drive so much, and you have better public transportation. You're able to buy more things locally. There's more local production. And from the point of view of, say, a technocrat, or even perhaps from the point of view of GDP, our kind of primary, societal indicator of, the health of the economy, it actually looks very bad. But from a local perspective, it could actually, imply a lot of development. So I don't know if I'd call that, if it would imply growth per se, at least in the ways that we calculate growth. But do you want to speak a little bit more on, this idea of, I guess, this idea of subsidiarity and this idea of kind of inculcating new patterns that, that might, actually prefigure, a larger scale transition down the line?
Definitely. I mean, that's a huge and central aspect of what we're talking about here, because precisely because of the tension that drives, there's a kind of, you could think of it as a transcendent pattern that tends towards centrality, given the costs of complexity in subsidiary or more marginal structures, more complex networks that have to navigate those, in Cognition terms, which are slightly outdated, like transaction costs, right? Like there's more friction in a more complex system. And oftentimes when that friction creates pain or suffering for people, people are amenable to someone who comes forward with a centralized solution that obviates that suffering in the short term, but at the cost of sacrificing some autonomy, giving up that control to the centralized planner, right? But the interesting thing about the world that we're in and the weird inclusion of information technologies, despite the fact that they are a byproduct of the industrial world, they mark, people speak about the information age, I mean, colloquially, but we should note that it's interesting that we also conceive of a transition occurring, and that transition brings in a new set of primitives. And then we have to ask the question, well, does that new set of technological or informational primitives change the game with respect to the transaction costs of more complex organization, right? And I think that's precisely, that's again, this role between energy and free energy and information in terms of our knowledge of how to interact with the world and our capacity to interact with the world changes our relationship to the kind of transformations that we can sustain, right? Without those becoming associated with suffering or degradation of the environment, et cetera. And previously, those transaction costs were simply too high to coordinate the kind of activities in a more dispersed way that you're talking about. I mean, even it's reflected even in terms of our governance structure of our nation, right? Like Washington, D.C., why? Because people had to ride horses to one place to talk, right? At the time. And then that's not the only reason. I'm being somewhat reductive, but that is a core functional reality of the time. People had to move to a given place when our country was founded if they wanted to actually share information between human brains. That's an important distinction to make between then and now, despite the fact that we are living inside the wake of those decisions, right? And that's constantly where we're at with respect to the past, living inside the wake of those constraints and decisions, but also responsible for generating new patterns such that when those past patterns and constraints give way, we actually have something that can act as at least a substitute, and hopefully something that does that and more for less, ideally, right? And so I think that's this interesting element of human creativity and the human role in this process is that enabling role. I do think that that's also the human spirit aspect of autonomy and of subsidiarity or localism. That respect for the fact that human spirit like flourishes in its most vibrant form when it is able to actually be in direct relationship with its local reality, as opposed to living inside an abstraction of itself constantly, like which is the central planning way of looking at the world. It's like, here's the map. Okay, the territory, who cares? The territory will have to be made to concord with the changes we make to the map, right? Like the more we centralize, the more we abstract over the world, the more we end up in that situation where we force map on territory, as opposed to using map to exist in adaptive relation to territory. And so, I mean, I completely agree that those transformations are coming. And I think that they're a function of the fact that we're reducing the cost of coordination and reducing the cost of communication. And we're just figuring out how to pair that with human behavior, human psychology, the tendencies that emerge within human minds when we actually link ourselves up using digital communications and interact via screens or contexts that don't take advantage of our embodied understanding of communication, whether that's
There's a lot of environmental
tactile or
mismatch right now.
yes,
There's a lot of
yes, yeah.
environmental mismatch right now.
And attendant with that mismatch or to that mismatch are a whole set of growing pains, right? And we're trying to figure that out. And different communities establish their different subsets or even potentially their own technologies for communicating with their own norms. And also as the technologies change, hopefully we see less parasitic behavior in terms of using human beings as fuel for pure extraction mechanisms and actually, mostly taking advantage of the beneficent or at least the very useful capacities to network brains together, because that's a very powerful tool to be able to network brains together. We don't think sufficiently about just how massive a transformation that is in terms of light speed networking of human perception and action. We get a little bit of a flavor for it on the negative side with the sort of the positive side. The positive aspirational side would be sort of the flash mob videos that aren't as much of a thing anymore. But initially, we're sort of positive experimentation with the idea of using online tools to coordinate behavior that brought some sort of humor or joy or at least novelty to a particular domain in reality. Recently, with the more polarized extraction-oriented social media, we've seen more spontaneous emergence of like frustration and anger or reflection of that collective psyche brought out in point locations in the world. But people are, the vast majority of people I know in my professional and in my personal life as well, this is one of the primary problems that we're all working on is like, well, what does it mean to allow us to simultaneously be in better embodied relationship to our environments from the ground up and have tools that take advantage of information technologies to facilitate and catalyze that with the knowledge, using the knowledge of human psychology for synthesis and creativity as opposed to exploitation, as opposed to manipulation and nudging control. So yeah, this topic, it pulls in all of these threads, but that's because it lies at the sort of point of synthesis that we, any creation of something novel that in theory could be adaptive has to emerge from a point of synthesis. And, I think that you and I and these entire communities that we're in, if something emerges that allows us to make this transition in a way that is at least pseudo stable, it's going to come out of these spaces. And hopefully, I think the best we can hope for is like, if you look at Manhattan, look at a time lapse of Manhattan over 100 years, right? Like 100 years ago, you take an image, today you take an image, they look completely different, but there was no collapse in between, right? There was a series of micro collapses and rebuildings, right? Literally rebuildings that occurred there, a continuous process of transformation that literally renewed it in sort of the ship of Theseus metaphorical sense, mythological sense, right? Like a continuous rebuilding or replacement. While the materials change and maybe the sources of those materials change and evolve, the actual underlying functional metabolic relations still maintain at least integrity, but they also have to change their constitution or pattern so that, and this is, again, we haven't talked as much about the ecological side effects, but like it's very important that we're not just injecting all of our disorder into ecological systems in ways that disorder those systems. But yeah.
Yeah. So you're kind of a new homesteader. You have
2 years now or so.
2 years now. Yeah, you have a place, in the mountains, and we don't have to say where. And I remember last year you were posting pictures of you're experimenting with like square foot gardening, and you described on the timeline, on the Twitter timeline, of how you see this as a very important process for yourself in thinking about these larger scale dynamics to kind of develop an embodied sense of these dynamics in a very kind of tangible way. You're actually dealing with living creatures and plants and organisms and noticing the relationships, and this is giving you insights. Do you want to talk about a little bit about kind of what you're doing up there and how it's informing your work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so, oh man. So fundamentally, I guess I look at it as 2 years in. First of all, I resonate with the idea that there's no bigger job than a little bit of land. Like that's
No,
a
what?
very no bigger job than a little bit of land.
Yeah, absolutely.
um, because there's literally in this little slice of the world just here there's infinite complexity if you're willing to pay attention to it. And so there's a few different parts of what I'm up to here. Part of it is the actual transformation of the zone zero type of locations in permaculture speak, the actual like the office that I spend time in now and workshop and home, shed, and that part of our spaces, and trying to understand how those evolve in relationship to the increasingly extensive locations on the land. But then there's also the locations that are right under more human management. So at the front of our property, it's a part of the property that was cleared and has been not fully cleared. They left, a large blue spruce, a couple large Doug firs, and a really beautiful old red cedar, which we really love. It's one of our favorite trees here. Amongst I think also decorative cherry and a few other like trees, but it's mostly like it's the human space, right? And like our garden is in that now, and we're increasingly beginning to integrate and figure out and how to plan more of a sort of food forest approach to that in the long term, not a high density one. We still want to have some open spaces for us to be able to spend time sort of doing sort of activities that require a little bit more openness. But so that's the front of the property. And then the second third of the property is something like, it's a third or fourth growth part of the forest that was cleared about 70 years ago or so, when this part of the land was just purely under agricultural management. And right now, we're sort of in a riparian zone. And that part of the forest, or that part of the land is it's wetter ground, bacterial soils, and a lot like big leaf maple, a lot of alder, a lot of other native undergrowth as well. And so a lot of frontier species, I guess you'd call it, right? Like repopulating at different levels, different stories of the forest, and then behind that is old growth. And so I'm giving this general overview because all my activities are in relation to this entire system. I'm trying to figure out ways of catalyzing the transition of that middle part of the land back into fungally dominated, more old growth type of soil and forest ecology, as I also experiment with a number of different strategies for food production at sort of homestead scale, and also use those as potential opportunities for experimenting with certain ideas about network flows and information flows that, while they apply to humans, can also apply to the relationships between certain inputs and outputs of function, like look as viewed from an informational or functional perspective of those different processes being plants in relation to one another, right? And so you mentioned square foot, right? And it's funny because the first year I had all of this other stuff going on. Like we've gotten married since we got here. We had our first child since we got here. We've been remodeling the home. We've been building up the garden. We had to do a bunch of, we didn't use heavy machinery, and we did a bunch of earth moving projects initially. So it's just been a ton. And that first year I was just kind of like, okay, I'm gonna get some basic garden beds in. And I know that the relationship between these organisms is not ideal in rational relation, like in a square foot process, right? You can manage them in a way that you can manage them if you're. I was conscious of basic proximity and anything that would obviously like fully inhibit, but I wasn't trying to really think of it, the three-dimensional root structure and light structure as impacted by the different layers of foliage, and looking into the molecular processes and how to potentially arrange that geometry as much at that point, which I've started getting a little bit more into. But this is all the conceptual level, and at some level as well, and a much deeper level, I do a lot of abstract work during the day in my sort of quote unquote day job. And so the process of just direct embodiment and allowing my, I kind of think it as the way I think of consciousness is a very process oriented way of thinking about consciousness. And that loop is me, right? But when I'm doing my abstract work, that loop is very tight in my headspace. Let's say it's a very tight loop that's not extended out, it's not flowing out into my sensory apparatus and bringing back a lot of embodied grounding perception in relation to my conception, right? But when I'm in the garden or on the land or working with a tool like an axe or something that like I actually have to be in my body. It's quite wonderful to really see that process of consciousness, that loop of consciousness, begin to extend and grow out to the entire surface area of contact with the external world, and notice the shift and the phenomenological shift in the way that my being in the world changes, and therefore my attitude and perceptions change alongside that. And those two different kinds of work and two different kinds of processes exist in mutual relationship. And I think I kind of like to think of it as, and it's not my term by any means, but like trying to keep my feet on the ground while my head is in the clouds, and like that stretches you and kind of generates that kind of growth. And that's the kind of growth that I feel is called for in humanity, like that stretching of humanity, that growth, that filling in of this part of us that becomes a question when we try to pull ourselves between two polarities, right? I think humanity is kind of in that state right now. And we don't just need to get bigger, right? It's like by trying to stretch ourselves between these more difficult constraints, we have to become more than what we are. And so I feel like, being on the land and trying to constantly be in relationship to my local environment while also performing all of this abstract work and information theory and computational structure. So, it helps create a symmetry there.
Right. Has it I'm curious your thoughts on kind of agriculture, food production in general. There's a lot of debates, for example, of whether, say, regenerative agriculture or permaculture could, quote unquote, feed the world. For example, there's debates about the role of fertilizers, right, as kind of like this external input. And I read, by the way, Energy and Civilization by Smil. I got through it, and one thing that he points out, which I think is something that kind of alt growers need to contend with, is as he points out, before the rise of fossil fuels, one, we are deforesting our land, pretty severely, at least in Europe, but in other places as well. But there was also, there was probably a max capacity for human muscle power and animal power, given the constraints on the environment, to feed, a certain amount of people, right? And so when we're pointing out the problems of industrial agriculture, and we're saying we need to think about alternatives, it's not, it really can't look like the past. It's not going to be traditional agriculture. It might take many elements from traditional agriculture, many heuristics from traditional agriculture, but it will be something fundamentally new. And it probably will have to integrate many aspects of modernity and many aspects of this kind of cutting edge informational theory and complex systems theory. It'll have to probably integrate much of that. I'm curious, kind of your thoughts on kind of the permaculture, regenerative ag scene, where you see their blind spots and I guess capacities to evolve, or capacities for industrial agriculture to become more holistic, I guess.
Yeah, that's a fundamental tension given the constraint you mentioned with respect to how easy it is to destroy a living process for its embodied energy versus how difficult it is for that embodied process to accumulate or become a store of that energy across time. And there's an asymmetry there. And every time we eat, every time an animal eats, every time we burn, every time we do any of these processes, we are partaking in an asymmetry that typically takes longer or has taken longer to produce the input than can be replenished on the output side. And yet and then also because we're in that loop, right? We have a subjective perception of what it's like to be in that loop. And for a long period of time, being in that loop meant very little autonomy, very little freedom, just for basic survival. It meant you didn't get to wake up and choose what you wanted to do that day. It's like what you're going to do that day was largely dictated by necessity of maintaining the minimum viable processes that were going to keep you and perhaps your immediate family or local community alive and safe at a basic level. And so it's this question of the reason we developed all of these other additional layers beyond that is because incrementally people found slight little, this is the interesting thing about people. We find that's a unique interest, or that's a process that needs to be done, and I can do it X way, right? Or maybe based on some sets of properties in that task, I can create something to help me do that lets me shift my attention and energy elsewhere. And we've created all of these pieces of infrastructure that allow us to do that, and we don't think about them as infrastructure from the modern perspective. Like when we say, we're practicing permaculture, and you can be quite anti-techno utopian while still feeling perfectly comfortable using a shovel. But shovels didn't always exist. Shovels were at one point a novel invention that helped us to manipulate earth better than a stick, right? And so even the metal that we use to produce those shovels evolved, and the processes that were required to produce that metal evolved, and all of that shifted increasingly toward giving us more capacity and time for redirecting our attention at the cost of requiring more energy as inputs. And so there's always this question of okay, well, what are we willing to give up if we want to? You could look at it and say yes, you could go to a much lower level of embodied energy or energy demand on our local environment and ecological impact on our environment. But are we willing to give up every piece of the pie or of the puzzle that allows us to have any autonomy, any freedom for us to be talking now, for us to be able to even not have to constantly think about, not be hungry all the time, basically, not worry about pathogens at all times, not, all of these elements. We can talk about a world that we're forced to give them up in, but very few people are going to choose to give them up. And so I tend to think it's, how do you maintain, again, or how do you change the relationship to those processes, input sources and output externalities, while maintaining at least similar levels of functionality to what we have today? And I think that it's we can't just, we can't operate on the assumption that everything the human mind has added to this equation is something that we should look at with suspicion. And also because we have created processes that have held so much potential, and some of that potential has created obviously negative side effects, acting as if every alleviation or every degree of free time that we've gained from that, or health that we've gained from that, is sort of in zero-sum relationship with the environment. I think that's also it's going to lead us to just loathe ourselves, which we see a lot of. Language around human being as a virus or a parasite. When we are, you could also, harkening back to our earlier part of the conversation, you could just say we're young, trees at the early stage of their evolution, having just stumbled across the lignin protein, right? Like we are creating, we might be, we're literally, as those trees acidified their environments, we are acidifying our oceans. Like as they created anoxic environments, we are also creating environments where we're changing the actual constitution of the atmosphere so that other life processes suffocate. And so, at the scale of homesteading or at the scale of permaculture, I think it's one of those things where, at least personally, the way that I approach this is if I can use an energy source, any energy source to produce something that could be useful in changing in developing patterns that are either increase that rate of regrowth, right? Or close some other additional loop. Right. I kind of treat that as a win because that new closure or that new process, that, especially if it could be substituted for any other input of energy, right? Like that's the nice thing about anything electric tools or anything that can be powered with electric is that simultaneously you have the ability to arbitrarily change where that energy is coming from, as long as it is transformed into electricity. You have to store it in batteries, and this is obviously a point of contention amongst many people. But I think that if you look at the profile in terms of the land we have to disturb or disrupt to procure that for now, not even factoring in things like metamaterials, et cetera, it's a much smaller footprint than the land we're disrupting for the equivalent of like a gasoline motor tool, right? Or an engine in a large vehicle. And so
maybe that's a whole conversation.
It is.
We don't need to go down that rabbit hole. I mean, there's some predictions that the amounts of metals that all of these key ingredients, lithium, cobalt, nickel, etc., would have to be mined at a scale unforeseen in our history, even in our cumulative history. But anyway, because
also assuming our current capacity for reintegrating used products, which
perhaps, but there's also
energy constrained.
Yeah, this gets into, I mean, it kind of doubles back to our earlier conversation. I don't know if we'd make any progress here. Some predictions. There's Simon Michaud. He had this. He's part of the Geological Survey of Finland or something, but he did this 1,000-page report, basically, taking all of these factors into account. Of course, people can criticize his calculations and stuff, but the amount of many of these metals that we have that we would need for this kind of full transition is much more than we currently even have known reserves for, and in many cases much more than we've ever extracted. So even if we were to recycle everything, it still wouldn't be enough. But anyway, I think that's getting.
Well, that dovetails into conversations about this adaptive process of as those prices go up, and like this is why earlier I mentioned that question of when we're talking about peak oil. One of the reasons why, I'm not saying like I'm going to fully agree with this perspective, but I'm going to at least put it out there because it is a perspective out there. One of the reasons why some economists will say, the supply of oil is infinite is because of the fact that they predict that the dynamics of human behavior in relationship to potentially increasingly constrained oil will mean that we essentially move to some substitute before we ever take all the oil out of the ground. And therefore, for all intents and purposes, the amount of oil is infinite. I'm not going to you can go in a lot of different directions from that in terms of like how you approach the conception of what is infinite or finite, et cetera. But all, with respect to metals, we are observing the collective observation, like we're observing our own observation that what you're talking about is a tendency or property or constraint of our current world, and that's starting to trigger new or incentivize new behaviors. So like we have a asteroid mining industry emerging. You can talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but all it means in my mind is that it's hard to talk about what it means to have a hard constraint on something like a rare earth metal. Like I would, again, I think where information can be substituted for, where information and energy alone can be substituted for direct extraction, I would like to see that happen, which is why I really, I think I'm more interested by the domain of metamaterials than I am asteroid mining, right? Like I think it also is much
And
more
just to be clear,
reflective of my.
metamaterials is trying to manipulate materials at an atomic level in order to basically do modern day alchemy, but in a way that actually scientifically makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, think about it as instead of weaving a blanket with, there are many. This is a simple analogy, but instead of weaving a blanket with cotton fibers, you could weave a blanket at the atomic scale or molecular scale, depending on what you're talking about, such that the way that those properties interact at that small scale produces other emergent properties at the human scale or at the scale of the function that they're supposed to fulfill, right? So one of the initial uses of the research domain, I mean, just like everything else, the military, DARPA, they fund quite a wide array of possible experiments, but one of the fun ones in the metamaterials domain was trying to produce real world invisibility cloaks, right? So, which means that like you wrap something in a layer of this metamaterial, and the properties of the material itself means that when a photon enters it, it can travel around the outside of that whole material and then exit out the other side on the same trajectory. So that if you're looking at something, you're basically seeing the light coming from behind it,
Right.
with minimal distortion, which is like you said, magic, like invisibility, or the Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But again, at some point that was a shovel. And so, yeah,
Let me ask
I
you.
bias toward that because I think that reflects I think the vision of humans as information energy synthesizers in sustainable relationship to our ecology is a much higher calling than human beings as resource extractor, profit maximizers, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a paradigm shift. Well, let me go back to the agriculture real quick. And so, you kind of went into, not necessarily being shy about adopting new technologies due to some kind of ideological predisposition against technology. What about, so I mean, and earlier we've talked about kind of the inherent scale of how the scaling kind of dynamics of how industrialization occurred. And besides kind of the ecological impacts of agriculture and impact on the biogeochemical cycle and ocean eutrophication and many various other things. There's also just this kind of dynamic of monoculture, farming, producing, hollowing out, say, rural areas, lack of kind of diversity, both biodiversity and that connects to kind of cultural vibrancy as well. Do you see I guess cause or signs of a trend back towards kind of relocalization and diversification of food production again? Or I guess are you hopeful for that, or do you see signs of that?
I'm hopeful for it, and I think based on my own investigations and examinations and perspective, I tend to see once again. So there are tendencies towards large scale, centralization that drive the reality for most farmers. So in my area, I'm friends with a lot of farmers and orchardists here who are trying to produce at a scale that can actually sustain themselves, their families, and beyond. One of my neighbors tried it for a little while, and then they weren't able to actually. They left their previous job and tried to make it farming. And there are farmers here who are definitely doing fine for themselves, but it's by no means it's by no means an easy way to live relative to other ways of living. Not that it necessarily should be easy, and I think it being meaningful for people is in the final analysis more important than it being easy. But all of that being said, one of the reasons why this cost pressure exists is because of the fact that so many of the food systems around us are placing their entire marginal structure upon the shoulders ultimately of the farmer, right? So like the farmer is the person who ultimately gets squeezed in terms of competing with others to provide the lowest price good, or not. Like there's quality metrics for sure, and that's improved, and as the public is demanded different foods and higher quality foods and better transparency into food production processes. That's shifting slowly, but the economics of that are still quite the powerful force. And I think that, to the extent those food production and consumption networks are increasingly localized, you can start to create different social dynamics that aren't quite as tipped toward the abstraction of price as the primary driver of behavior. I think there will always be some signal mediating sort of need and provision. But in smaller communities, that signal can be constituted by something other than something as simple or as reductive as what we call monetary price at the moment. And so, and I also think that to the extent that like farmers are able to incorporate novel technology, hopefully with lower externalities, that not technology with a different telos, with a different purpose, technology that is not designed to maximize the yield of a robust single monocrop at a particular density threshold that only makes sense when sold on a large market, but that allows for a small diversity of food that A, can help supplement a family's needs, and then B, potentially as an externality to the local marketplace, be a form of revenue, or at least goodwill, trust, reciprocity. That kind of metabolic community metabolism of like food and goodwill, reciprocity, and all these human factors as well, that are more present at like, if people are familiar with actual farmers markets, not the sort of like proxies that pop up in cities with remote farmers that come into an urban area and call it a farmers market, which is not actually what a farmers market in local context is, where you actually know the people involved and have relationships and have iterated reciprocity with these real human beings in your environment, and therefore aren't as you're much more willing to like acknowledge like a human being did something here of worth, and it's not just a price tag, right?
But moving in this direction, does this imply that like populations would eventually become more distributed, and technology itself would move from kind of this centralizing force to you'd have this kind of cosmolocal distributed kind of technology environment with global information commons and various things, like, because I could just imagine wanting to
There will
move
always be
away
that
from
other
large
attractor.
scale commodity crop production with the mega cities we have now is probably impossible, right? I mean, there can be some degree of urban agriculture, but not nearly enough to feed those populations. And so you can't really get around this kind of abstract price signal commodity production, if you
And
have
most likely
populations.
those food supplies will try to move towards high density urban agriculture, indoor hydroponic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which, if you can reduce the externality footprint on that, I'm
Yeah.
not saying it's ideal, but it's probably better than what they're doing today. Because also the interesting thing here is what they're doing today produces a ton of other side effects for other communities that might want to act differently. And so I think it's really interesting and necessary for us to conceptualize what it means if you think of this as like a two attractor system, with like one attractor being that tendency toward urbanization, centralization, efficiencies that come along with economies of scale, the price pressures that come along with that. People will be attracted to that because it's fundamentally, there are properties of that are fundamentally attractive to individuals, and you can't expect everybody to reject it. So that will, like, I don't think that that's ever going to go away as a driver of incentives. But what I do think can happen is for local and regional spaces to carve out a kind of decoupling and a locally integrous or metabolically self-sufficient or closed infrastructure, not fully closed, but closed with respect to not being a source of just its outputs are just all the inputs of the large central city, right? Like, which is an observation talking about eco-socialism, right? This was one of the observations of socialism or Marx in general, and the socialist lineage that follows him. That it is accurate when you look at the entire network topology. There are far more inflows of materials from the area around a city into the city than you see in terms of outflows back the other direction. And so you can draw all sorts. I don't draw the same conclusions as a lot of eco-socialists or just general Marxists draw from that, but the pattern exists. And I think that to the extent that we can use information technology to network and provide other kinds of self-sufficient, stable metabolic functions that focus on different values and represent those values within that, internalize the representations of those values in their networks. To the extent you can grow something like that, you can create a kind of a seed of something that could grow to be a alternate attractor, so to speak, and at least perhaps a repository. And I think this is in line to some extent with the biolocalism and like doomer optimism movement, like a repository of new behaviors, experimentations, and ways of being that, to the extent the old system starts shaking and breaking down, there become more opportunities for, let us say, evangelizing that, right, beyond the networks that already see it as valuable.
Yeah, yeah. The term that I like to use, I think, with what you're describing, is kind of bioregionally integrated cities. Not, and that doesn't mean complete autarky, but it does imply much more of these kind of circular flows, and in my mind, probably more distributed populations, but
Can I ask a clarifying
dense,
question?
but still, plenty of density. And like you said, there's opportunities for indoor hydroponics and various, other ways to grow food.
Are you talking about the relationship between cities in terms of cities as current geographic entities and the periphery? Or are you talking about generating this within those more peripheral locations as a what did you say? A city?
Bioregionally integrated cities.
Yeah, is that something that happens outside of present cities or in relation to present cities
I
fundamentally?
think it's both. I think that you will have new densities. I would like to see kind of new proto civilizations arise kind of in the periphery, and you perhaps see this with at least people trying with kind of like the eco village movement and various things. But realistically, I think that many of the cities aren't going to go away. Many people aren't going to move from the cities, and so then, but the incentive structures might change such that more people, perhaps the populations do become a little bit more distributed, and this kind of centralizing dense urban megacity trend, that dynamic shifts a little bit. And it's such that it basically allows more integration to be possible, where the urban center is not just importing all the resources from the hinterland and exporting all of its waste.
Yeah. And so, like, to tie all of this together in a pragmatic way, because I know we're kind of also coming up on time here, but so, like, in order to achieve something like that, I think that that network, for it to be a proper and sustainable, self-sustaining metabolic or econometabolic closure, one way of thinking about that is you need to look around you on your property or in your room, and like every item, catalog every item in every part and every flow coming in, and saying like, okay, how many of those are enclosable or providable in that current metabolic space that is not networked to this massive outside economic provision. And right now we're starting with a very low number, right? It's a very small fraction of that entire set. And I think kind of the argument that I'm making cashes out in its most simplistic form, that using information to open up new sources of free energy locally allow us to dramatically improve that fraction, and therefore increase the probability or possible viability of those sort of econo-local cities.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
or
I
at
mean,
least
we are
decouple
running
them from
short on
decouple them or disentangle them from all of the necessities or dependencies that often put them at the mercy
time.
of this much larger inertia.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we should probably should wrap up quite soon. Do you have any, I guess, last words and anything that you want to that you think we missed or that you want to emphasize, kind of leave our audience with?
I guess I'll just be very simple. I would say we have to resist the temptation to simple or what appear to be simple answers or simple conclusions here. I think that this process, humanity, we are responsible for, and as any given human, we are responsible for, to the extent we can, helping to enable our own continuity in light of the health of the things around us, and that's never a simple process. And to the extent that we frame it as such, I think we're less likely to make progress than more likely.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Matthew. Yeah, I appreciate you coming on, and I feel like this
Appreciate you
conversation.
inviting me.
Yeah, I appreciate. I think this conversation, could have gone in so many different directions, and so, but I think it was a good one. So appreciate it, and until next time.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure talking to you.
Cool. Take care, Matthew.
Yeah.